Machine has appeared in homes across America.
Double and redouble his power. 32x.
6 times more powerful than 3D and 40 times more than Super NES.
Hey, yo, there is no 32-bit Super NES. Show me!
Increase the power of the unit 40 times.
What was that? Hi everyone, I'm Tyler, and welcome to another episode of Player One Start. Today we're going to talk about the Sega 32x. To understand why Sega even released an add-on to the Genesis to make it a 32-bit console, you first need to understand a little bit about the 16-bit wars between Sega and Nintendo. In the early 1990s, Sega released an aggressive ad campaign against Nintendo here in North America, where they flaunted the abilities of the 16-bit Genesis as compared to the 8-bit Nintendo. Hence the slogan, Genesis does what Nintendo don't. Eventually, Nintendo did release a 16-bit console of their own. However, Sega had already gained a strong foothold in the North American market. However, by the time of 1994, about the time that the 32X would have been released, Sega was losing ground to Nintendo. And the research and development teams at Sega contributed to the fact that they were trying to run advanced games on hardware that just wasn't capable. Never mind the fact that Nintendo was cranking out hit after hit, like Star Fox and Donkey Kong Country. So in the style of releasing add-ons, which Nintendo had rumored for years they were going to release a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo but never did, Sega jumped the gun and released their CD add-on, and they decided to do the same thing to increase the longevity of the Genesis by releasing a 32-bit console add-on for the Sega Genesis. So this project initially came up when I purchased a game off of eBay. I had been looking for the game Knuckles Chaotix for the 32X almost as long as I've owned the 32X. So I ended up getting Knuckles Chaotix on eBay for a very good price, and it got shipped over to me, and it didn't work. To make sure I wasn't crazy, I decided to check and make sure that my other 32X games worked, and they did. So I contacted the seller and started the process of returning the item when I thought I should try everything in my power to get this to work. So the first thing I did was I cleaned the contacts of the cartridge, and no success. The second step I did was I cleaned the contacts of the 32X into the Genesis. And I had no success with Knuckles Chaotix, but then all of a sudden my other games quit working too. So I was wondering, if I'm improving how the performance should work on this, why is it deteriorating? So I had another problem. I either was facing a hardware problem on my 32X or a hardware problem in my Genesis. I decided to troubleshoot my Genesis. I unhooked the 32X out of it, and I tried playing normal Genesis games.
Power up.
Every single one that I tried worked flawlessly. Then I tried playing a Sega Genesis game that I knew worked on my Genesis in my 32X, and it worked. To a certain extent. Eventually it finally froze. And the next step was to try out all of my 32X games, which at this point they had all stopped working. So now I'm not thinking it is a problem with my Genesis or the game, it's gotta be a problem with the 32X. So I decided to take the 32X apart. So to take apart the 32X, you first have to take apart the 4 screws on the back. And when you get those off, then the top piece should slide right off. Next, there are a whole bunch of screws holding down the RF shield, so you'll have to take those apart as well. And once you get the shield off, it exposes the logic board. While researching online forums, one of the first steps people said I should try was to reseat these two ribbon cables in the front. So I decided to do that right now, and then before putting it back together to test it, I'm just going to bring it down with that top piece off and pray that it works. Well, what do you know? Sometimes the simplest things will fix these older electronics. Let's try this again with Knuckles Chaotix. Remember, this game never worked before. It works. I tried it with every game that I own for the 32X, which isn't that many, so it didn't take that long. So overall, I am very pleased with how this project came together. It was a very simple fix, and something that I hope I don't have to do for a while, because I'm hoping the 32X will keep working. Now, I decided to do some research just on my own to see if I can find out if the Sega 32X hardware was actually faulty. There were a lot of things going around that since you had 3 separate power adapters, one for the Genesis, one for the 32X, and one for the Sega CD, people assumed that somehow there would be a crossed wire in there somewhere, but I actually find the 32X is built in just as good as quality, if not better, than the Sega Genesis, and its add-on, the Sega CD. One thing I really wish would have came to light is that there was actually an unreleased console that Sega was planning to release back in the mid-90s called the Sega Neptune, at least that was its code name. And really what it was is it was a standalone 32X that would also play Sega Genesis games. Now, Sega decided to scrap this project because the Saturn was just about ready to be released. In fact, the Sega 32X didn't come out that much before the Sega Saturn did. So I would really like to see someone come out with a Sega 32X and Genesis retro console. I don't know how many people out there would have run into the same problem and just assumed the Sega 32X was dead, and they probably scrapped their console needlessly when it could have been just an easy fix. One thing I'm excited about is now I can finally go out and start collecting more Sega 32X games. Now, from what I've read online, there wasn't a lot of good 32X games, just as there was not a lot of good Sega CD games, but I still feel that this is something I like to collect, because these are games that, for better or for worse, I've never played before, and I'd really like to get the opportunity to judge these games for myself. And now that my 32X is working, it'll give me an opportunity to sample a couple of these games. The game I'm most looking forward to is the exclusive 32X game, Star Wars Arcade. I have to say that if I would have saw this game when it first came out back in the mid-90s, this would have blew my mind that it was coming out of a game console. I had yet to play games like X-Wing that came out for MS-DOS, and even though this is very similar to that style, I had never seen anything like this before. Comparing it today to other games that were around back then, I would say it most closely resembles Star Fox, although I think this game also has just a little bit better frame rate or a little bit better textured polygons. Something else I would have found shocking back in the day, and I kinda do now, is that this game actually has fully pre-sampled music, meaning that it's playing a stream, it's not actually synthesizing this music on the fly. Now, unfortunately, I'm going to have to talk through it, so you're just going to have to kind of listen to the background as I talk over it. Hopefully this won't be flagged through copyright reasons, because I am technically streaming a sample of the song rather than a rendered version off the console. But hopefully this gives you an idea of what the 32X sound hardware was capable of doing. I'm guessing that the sample rate of this is actually lowered because of the storage capacity of the cartridge, rather than the capability of the 32X sound hardware. So here is a 3D cutscene from the beginning of the game where you get to see an X-Wing fighter fly off from one of the Rebel ships. I actually didn't mute the sound in here, there's just nothing playing, so I don't know if it was their choice not to play any sound or if they didn't want the game to be annoying while it was just sitting there. But overall I found this scene very impressive. Right off the bat, the main problem I would have with this game is the voice of Admiral Akbar. It sounds nothing like him.
Attention all wing pilots. Stand by to receive orders.
It sounds like he picked up a German accent from a Nazi training camp or something. Overall, the controls are very simple, although playing with the directional pad is not as easy as it would be if I was playing with some sort of analog stick. The graphics, while they would have been impressive in 1994, don't really hold up well today. And the gameplay gets a little bit repetitive just because I didn't really get past the first few stages through playing it the first couple times. And all it is hunt and destroy fighters, and then hunt and destroy fighters some more. And then when you're tired of that, go ahead and hunt and destroy more fighters. And I didn't really see too much of a difference between the arcade game and the 32X game that's included on this cartridge. Alright, now let's play the mother of all fighting games in the mid-90s. We're going to play some Mortal Kombat. Now, I should forewarn you, I am not very good at this game, especially when facing off against the computer, so you're going to see me get my butt handed to me here a couple times. As I'm playing this game, I can't help but feel like there is not much difference from this version from the Sega Genesis version. So I'm going to play a little bit of this, and I'm going to play a little bit of the Sega Genesis version for you, so you can compare for yourself.
Fight.
Well, doesn't this look familiar? Even the menus look exactly the same between the two versions.
Fight.
So keeping in mind that the Sega 32X was very expensive, and the games themselves were actually more expensive than Genesis cartridges, I would have expected a lot more as a kid and would have been very disappointed, as there seems to be only minuscule differences between the 32X version and the Sega Genesis version. Alright, the last game we're going to be taking a look at is Virtua Fighter for the 32X. Now, this game also came out on the Sega Genesis, but since we already took a look back with Mortal Kombat, I decided to take a look forward with the Sega Saturn, because this game was also a launch title for that as well. The first difference I notice is the Saturn has a load time. The first thing that strikes me as odd is the sound isn't really that different between the two versions. Again, we see that the menus are not really too different between the two versions either.
Fight! One, ready, go!
So just like Mortal Kombat, there really isn't too much of a difference between these two games. I don't know which I feel more ripped off for, having the Sega 32X or having the Saturn version. So focusing exclusively on the 32X version, Virtua Fighter was one of the first, if not the first, 3D fighting game to make it into the home market. And if anything, it looks like it. I don't think the graphics really hold up very well. You may notice that the characters look a little squared, and that's because Sega decided to go in a different direction than most other 3D game developers. Instead of using triangles for polygons, they use squares, and they continued this into the Sega Saturn as well. Overall, I find this game to be a decent fighting game. The controls are simple. The only problem I have is that the characters move extremely slow. It looks like they float in the air when they jump. However, I would say that I enjoy the Saturn version a little bit better than I enjoy the 32X version. Would I recommend this game console to someone collecting games today? Well, my answer is going to be a hard no. If you're a collector that has to have everything, this should be after you've already collected everything else. There's really no need to get a 32X. A lot of the games that were released for this were released on other consoles, and sometimes they are almost as good or better versions, as you saw in this video. As for the exclusive games, such as Knuckles Chaotix and Star Wars Arcade, I really feel like these games don't really make it worth it to pay for this console and find the games and make sure it's working. The Sega 32X game library isn't necessarily huge, so that's another factor. You're not going to be able to play that many games with it. Now, I don't personally own any at the moment. However, there were these games that cross platforms between the 32X and the Sega CD, and I couldn't possibly imagine what market they would try to appeal to with that.
For those who purchased something other than a Sega Genesis,
Yeah, that's it.
our sincere condolences.
What a waste.
Because to play these games, you would already have to have the 32X and the Sega CD, and that was a pretty rare market back in the day. And again, from what I can tell, games like Night Trap and Fahrenheit were already available on Sega CD without the 32X game add-on. So I can only imagine that the changes that they'd make for these games are not too drastic from the original version. So for those of you that are unaware, I actually posted on my Twitter channel the possible topics for future videos, and this topic actually won astronomically more over the other topics I presented. And I hope to do this again in the future. So if you follow me on Player1Start on Twitter, you will actually be given an opportunity again in the future to choose one of my future video topics. Alright, well that about wraps it up for this video. Remember, if you like what you see, please remember to hit that like and subscribe button, share with a friend, and as always, thank you so much for watching and stay tuned because I have more content coming. I'll see you guys next time.